Chapter 22. Here's Where We Take California. On July 1st, after a week of working out and relaxing in Poughkeepsie, the boys packed up their possessions, loaded the Husky Clipper onto a baggage car, and headed for the 1936 U.S. Olympic trials. By 6 that evening, they had arrived at Princeton and entered the world of the Ivy League, the nation's oldest and most prestigious colleges. This was a world of status and tradition and wealth. It was unlike anything the boys had ever known. The young men who attended these schools weren't loggers and fishermen and farmers. They were the sons of bankers and lawyers and senators. The boys from Washington moved into the stately Princeton Inn. From their rooms, they watched Princeton graduates stroll around the neighboring golf course wearing knickerbockers, high argyle socks, and tweed caps. The boys stopped by the Princeton Boathouse, a large and elegant stone structure, and explored Lake Carnegie. Originally, Princeton crews had rowed in a nearby canal, but the boat traffic proved troublesome, so Princeton asked the wealthy steel tycoon Andrew Carnegie to build them a lake just for their crew. The result, Lake Carnegie, was shallow, straight, and protected. It was first-class rowing water. 6 crews were competing for the right to go to Berlin: Washington, California, the Pennsylvania Athletic Club, Navy, Princeton, and the New York Athletic Club. The field would be divided into 2 groups of 3 for the elimination heats on July 4th. The top 2 boats in each heat would advance to a final contest of 4 boats the next day. The boys from Washington were not so worried about the preliminaries. They would race against Princeton and the winged footers of the New York Athletic Club. Neither was a real contender. They were concerned about the finals, though. The 2,000-meter race was less than a third the length of the 4-mile Poughkeepsie competition. They weren't certain they could beat Cal at such a short distance. The start would be critical, and they'd been having trouble with their starts lately. On Saturday, the 4th of July, the boys left for their preliminary race a little before 6:30. It was a buggy, sultry evening. Several thousand people had gathered along the shores of the lake for the qualifying heats. A floating platform with starting stalls had been specifically built for the trials. The boys backed the Husky Clipper into their stall and waited. At the gun, Washington began to charge out in front almost immediately. Soon Mock told Dunhume to drop the rate. In the 3rd minute of the race, Hume dropped it further. Even as he dropped the rate, the boat began to widen its lead. By the halfway mark, Washington had opened water on both boats. As they began to approach the finish line, the wing footers made a move, sprinting past Princeton and challenging Washington. Mock told Hume to ease the stroke rate back up. The boys from Washington pulled briskly ahead and sliced across the finish line with 2.5-length lead. The boys were surprised at how easily they had won. Even in the muggy evening air, they'd hardly broken a sweat. Now it was time to watch the competition. They paddled out of the racing lanes and took up a position along the bank at about the 1,500-meter mark. The boys wanted to see for themselves how the California crew would fare. The race was tight, but in the final 500 meters, California executed a tremendous surge, suddenly blowing past both Navy and Penn. They won by a quarter of a boat length, and they had completed the course a full 10 seconds faster than Washington had. Cal obviously was exceptional when it came to rowing 2,000-meter sprint races. That night, the boys were filled with anxiety. Ulbrichtson went from room to room, sitting on the ends of bunks, reassuring his boys. He tried to remind them that they had in effect won a sprint in the last 2,000 meters at Poughkeepsie. He was telling them what they already knew in their hearts, but needed to hear one more time. They could beat any crew in America, including California, at any distance. All they had to do, he told them, was to continue to believe in one another. Thunderstorms rumbled over New Jersey the next morning. Rain pounded the roof of the Princeton Inn. By noon, though, the day had grown hot and muggy but clear. Lake Carnegie lay mirror smooth, reflecting a translucent blue sky. The final race to determine which crew would represent the United States in Berlin was not scheduled to begin until 5 p.m., so the boys spent most of the day inside, trying to stay cool. Late in the afternoon, the crowds began arriving, about 10,000 people braving the heat to witness just 6 minutes of racing. Back in the state of Washington, people in smoky little mill towns, on soggy dairy farms, in fancy Seattle mansions, and in the Huskies' drafty shell house on Lake Washington gathered around their radios, anxious to see if their boys would be going to Berlin. At 4:45, the crews from California, Pennsylvania, Washington, and the New York Athletic Club paddled out onto Lake Carnegie. As Washington tried to back into its stall, a large white swan blocked the way. Bobby Mock, yelling and waving his arms furiously, finally persuaded it to move slowly aside. Washington settled into position. Then California backed in. The Washington boys were bare-chested, having stripped off their jerseys just before climbing into their boats. They now sat with their oars in the water, ready for the first hard pull. Each boy stared ahead at the neck of the oarsman in front of him, trying to breathe slow and easy, settling his heart and mind into the boat. Tom Bowles had given Bobby Mock his lucky fedora. Now the coxswain reached under his seat and touched the old hat. A little after 5, the starting gun flashed. Washington got off to a poor start. The other 3 boats surged ahead. The New York Athletic Club went briefly to the head of the pack, but the Pennsylvania Athletic Club quickly snatched the lead back. California settled into 3rd place, 10 feet in front of Washington's bow. After rowing hard to regain momentum but still dead last, Bobby Mock and Don Hume slowly dropped the boat's stroke rate. Yet the Husky Clipper held its position just behind California's stern. A quarter of the way down the course, Bobby Mock found himself creeping up in California. He told Hume to drop the rate again. As they approached the halfway mark, the New York Athletic Club suddenly began to fade and quickly fell behind Washington. The Pennsylvania Athletic Club was in the lead. The Husky Clipper remained stuck on California's tail. The boys continued to row at the same rate. Don Hume and Joe Rance were setting the pace with the long, slow, sweet, fluid strokes, and the boys on each side were falling in behind them flawlessly. The boat became a single thing, gracefully and powerfully coiling and uncoiling itself, propelling itself forward. Each time the blades entered the lake, they disappeared almost without a splash or ripple. Just before the 1,500-meter mark, Bobby Mock leaned into Don Hume and shouted, "Here's California! Here's where we take California!" Hume knocked the stroke rate up just a bit, and Washington swiftly walked past Cal, seat by seat. They began to creep up on the Pennsylvania Athletic Club, then pulled even with them. But Bobby Mock still hadn't really turned the boys loose. At last, coming inside 500 meters, he barked at Hume. For 5 or 6 strokes, the bows of the 2 boats moved back and forth like the heads of racehorses coming down the stretch. Finally, Washington's bow swung decisively out in front by a few feet. From there on, Washington simply blew past the exhausted rowers from the Pennsylvania Athletic Club, swinging into the last few hundred meters with extraordinary grace and power. At the finish line, they were a full length ahead and still widening the lead. As they crossed the line, Bobby Mock stood bolt upright into the stern of the shell, triumphantly thrusting one fist into the air. All over the state of Washington, people stood and cheered. What had been a dream was now a reality. The boys from Washington were going to the Olympics. For the first time ever, Seattle was going to compete in an athletic event on the world stage. Sitting by the radio at Harry's new home on Lake Washington, Joyce and the kids cheered too. Harry said nothing, but pulled out a large American flag, tacked it on the wall above the radio, and stood back to admire it. The kids ran off to tell their friends. Joyce herself was quietly jubilant. The victory meant she would not see Joe again for a few months, but it would be worth the wait. Flashing broad, white grins, Joe and his crewmates paddled back to the Princeton shell house, tossed Bobby Mock in the water, fished him out, and then lined up for photographs. Ulberson said a few words, but they did not really capture the moment. Finally, he had in his grasp what had eluded him for years. Everything had come together. He had the right oarsmen, with the right attitudes, the right personalities, the right skills. Thanks to George Pocock, he had a perfect boat, sleek, balanced, and wickedly fast. He had a winning strategy and a coxswain with the guts and smarts to make hard decisions and make them fast. It all added up to something far beyond the sum of its parts. But there was a problem. That night, the chairman of the U.S. Olympic Rowing Committee, Henry Penn Burke, informed Al Ulberson, George Pocock, and Ray Ekman, the athletic director at Washington, that if the boys wanted to go to Berlin, they would have to pay their own way. Ulberson was stunned and livid. No one had hinted that the winning crew would have to fund its own trip. The university had barely been able to pay to send the boys east to Poughkeepsie and Princeton, and